The radio crackled with static, then went dead. Complete communications blackout across the entire forward operating base. 47 soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. No way to call for extraction. No way to coordinate air support. No way to warn headquarters about the incoming assault. The senior communications officers stared at their equipment in horror. 3 satellite arrays destroyed. All primary frequencies jammed. Backup systems fried by electromagnetic interference. Then a quiet voice from the corner said, "Permission to try an alternative approach, sir." Everyone turned to look at the young woman sitting at the auxiliary radio station, wearing sergeant stripes and a look of calm determination. The base commander almost laughed. She was just a backup radio operator, barely out of technical school. But when she began transmitting on a frequency that shouldn't have existed, using techniques that weren't in any manual, her voice suddenly came through crystal clear on every Allied channel within 200 miles. The entire command bunker fell silent as they realized their 22-year-old radio operator had just accomplished what their million-dollar equipment couldn't do. She had saved 47 lives and potentially prevented a strategic disaster. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sergeant Maria Santos sat in the cramped communications bunker at Forward Operating Base Viper, her small frame dwarfed by the massive radio equipment surrounding her. 22 years old, 5 feet, 4 inches tall, with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in regulation style and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to absorb every detail around her. She wore the standard desert camouflage uniform with communications specialist insignia, but there was something different about the way she carried herself, a quiet confidence that her fellow soldiers hadn't quite noticed yet. The base was located in a hostile region where communications were literally the difference between life and death, and Maria had been assigned as the backup radio operator, the person who monitored secondary frequencies while the senior technicians handled the important transmissions. The morning had started normally enough. The primary communications team was preparing for a complex operation involving multiple units coordinating across difficult terrain. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran with expert certifications in military communications, was running the main board. Sergeant Thompson, who had been working military radio for 8 years, was handling satellite coordination. Corporal Jenkins, fresh from advanced communication school, was managing the backup systems. They were the experienced professionals, the ones who had handled dozens of critical operations, the ones the base commander trusted with the lives of soldiers in the field. Maria Santos was simply there to assist, to monitor the quiet frequencies, to handle routine check-ins from patrol units that were operating in relatively safe areas. But this morning was different. Intelligence reports had been coming in all night about increased enemy activity in the region. A reconnaissance patrol of 47 soldiers had been conducting surveillance operations in a valley, approximately 30 miles northeast of the base, when they had discovered something that changed everything. The enemy wasn't just planning random attacks. They were preparing a coordinated assault on 3 separate Allied positions, including Forward Operating Base Viper itself. The patrol had managed to gather critical intelligence about timing, troop movements, and attack vectors, but they needed to transmit this information immediately, and then request emergency extraction before the enemy realized their surveillance had been discovered. The patrol's first transmission came through clearly at 0800 hours. Captain Walsh, the patrol leader, reported their findings and requested immediate extraction. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez acknowledged the transmission and began coordinating with higher command for helicopter support. The information was so critical that it needed to reach division headquarters immediately, the kind of intelligence that could save hundreds of lives if acted upon quickly. Rodriguez worked his equipment with practiced efficiency, establishing secure channels with multiple command levels, relaying the intelligence through proper channels, coordinating air support for the extraction mission. Everything was proceeding according to protocol when the first explosion shook the base at 0847 hours. Not close enough to cause immediate damage, but close enough to rattle equipment and send everyone scrambling to battle stations. The enemy had discovered the surveillance patrol and were beginning their assault earlier than expected. Within minutes, 3 more explosions followed in rapid succession, each one closer to the base perimeter. The patrol was now in immediate danger, trapped in hostile territory with enemy forces converging on their position. They needed extraction immediately, not in an hour, not in 30 minutes. But right now, Rodriguez tried to contact the patrol for an updated position report. But his primary radio produced only static. He switched to backup frequency, more static. Thompson tried the satellite system. The signal indicators showed the satellites were functioning, but no voice communication was getting through. Jenkins ran diagnostics on all backup systems while Rodriguez and Thompson worked frantically to restore communications. The electromagnetic interference from the explosions had disrupted something, but none of them could determine exactly what. They had trained for this scenario, they had backup procedures, they had redundant systems, but nothing was working. The base commander, Colonel Harrison, arrived in the communications bunker at 0852 hours with his operations staff. A 30-year veteran who had served in multiple combat zones, Harrison understood that communications were the lifeline for soldiers in the field. Without radio contact, the patrol was effectively cut off from all support. Without the ability to coordinate air support, helicopter extraction became exponentially more dangerous. Without the ability to relay the intelligence they had gathered, the upcoming enemy assault could achieve complete surprise against Allied positions. Status report, Harrison demanded, his voice tight with controlled urgency. Rodriguez looked up from his equipment, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning in the bunker. Sir, we have complete communications blackout with the patrol. Primary arrays are down, satellite links are intermittent, and all standard frequencies are either jammed or experiencing severe interference. We're working on it, but I can't give you a timeline for restoration. Thompson added his assessment. Sir, the electromagnetic signature suggests coordinated jamming equipment, possibly combined with directed energy weapons targeting our specific frequencies. This isn't random interference. Someone knew exactly how to disrupt our communication systems. The implications were clear to everyone in the bunker. The enemy hadn't just discovered the patrol. They had planned this entire scenario. They knew how to neutralize Allied communications. They knew the timing of the surveillance operation, and they were executing a sophisticated plan to eliminate the patrol and proceed with their assault on Allied positions. Jenkins reported from the diagnostic station. Sir, I'm reading massive interference across all standard military frequencies. It's like someone is broadcasting white noise on every channel we normally use. The equipment is functional, but we can't push a clear signal through the interference. Colonel Harrison absorbed this information while calculating rapidly in his head. The patrol had enough ammunition and supplies for perhaps 6 hours of sustained combat, but they were outnumbered and in hostile territory. Helicopter extraction would require precise coordination to avoid surface-to-air missiles. Air support would need accurate target information to avoid hitting Allied forces. Every minute without communications reduced the chances of a successful rescue. At 0856 hours, with tension filling the communications bunker like a physical presence, Maria Santos cleared her throat quietly. She had been monitoring her auxiliary equipment throughout the crisis, running her own diagnostics, analyzing the interference patterns that were blocking standard communications. Her equipment was simpler, older, designed for routine communications, rather than the sophisticated systems the senior technicians were using. But simplicity sometimes had advantages that complexity didn't possess. Sir, she said quietly, addressing Colonel Harrison directly, I might have an alternative approach. The bunker fell silent except for the static coming from multiple radio sets. Rodriguez looked at her with barely concealed irritation. This was not the time for junior personnel to be offering suggestions when experienced technicians were working the problem. Thompson glanced up from his satellite console with skepticism written across his face. Jenkins paused his diagnostic work to listen, but his expression suggested he didn't expect much from the backup radio operator. Colonel Harrison, however, had learned during 3 decades of military service that good ideas could come from unexpected sources. Combat had taught him that rank and experience didn't always correlate with innovation, especially when conventional approaches were failing. He looked directly at Maria Santos, noting the calm confidence in her eyes, the way she seemed unaffected by the chaos around her. "What kind of alternative approach, Sergeant Santos?" he asked. Maria stood up from her position at the auxiliary radio station, moved to the main console, and began explaining what she had observed. "Sir, the jamming is sophisticated, but it's focused on standard military frequencies and protocols. They're broadcasting interference on the channels they expect us to use, with power levels calculated to overcome our normal transmission strength. But there are gaps in their coverage. Frequencies they're not monitoring because they're not supposed to exist." Rodriguez interrupted. "Sergeant, we've tried all authorized frequencies. The interference covers the entire spectrum we're supposed to use." Maria nodded respectfully but continued. "Yes, sir, but I'm not talking about authorized frequencies. I'm talking about frequencies that were used by Allied forces in previous conflicts. Channels that are technically still available but not included in current communication protocols. The enemy jamming is based on current doctrine, not historical usage patterns." Thompson looked skeptical. "Even if such frequencies exist, we don't have the protocols or codes for secure transmission on non-standard channels." Maria moved to her auxiliary equipment and began adjusting settings that none of the other technicians recognized. "Sir, I've been studying historical communications patterns as part of my own research. Some of these older frequencies and protocols are still viable, and because they're not in current use, they're not being jammed." Colonel Harrison studied the young sergeant's face, trying to assess whether she was offering a genuine solution or grasping at straws in a desperate situation. Combat experience had taught him to recognize the difference between confidence-based a knowledge and confidence based on hope. What he saw in Maria Santos's eyes was the former. She knew something the others didn't, and she believed it could work. "How confident are you that this approach will work, Sergeant?" he asked. Maria met his gaze directly. "Sir, I can't guarantee success, but I can guarantee that our current approach isn't working. The patrol has been without communications for 12 minutes. Every minute we wait reduces their chances of successful extraction. I believe I can establish contact within 5 minutes using alternative frequencies and protocols." The bunker was silent except for the continuing static from the main radio systems. 47 soldiers were trapped behind enemy lines, their lives depending on re-establishing communications. Conventional approaches had failed. Time was running out. Colonel Harrison made his decision. "Permission granted, Sergeant Santos. Show us what you can do." Maria Santos moved to her auxiliary station with steady hands, but she could feel the weight of every eye in the bunker watching her every move. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez crossed his arms and exchanged a meaningful glance with Thompson, both men clearly skeptical that a junior enlisted soldier could solve a problem that had stumped experienced communications specialists. The backup radio operator position was traditionally filled by someone who handled routine transmissions, monitored quiet frequencies, and performed basic maintenance tasks. It wasn't a role that required advanced technical knowledge or creative problem-solving. Maria had been assigned to Forward Operating Base Viper only 6 months ago, fresh from the Defense Information School at Fort Gordon, where she had completed the standard military communications course with solid but unremarkable grades. Her personnel file showed a typical enlisted soldier's background. Born in San Antonio, Texas, raised by a single mother who worked as a nurse at the local veterans hospital. High school graduate with decent grades in mathematics and science, but nothing that suggested exceptional technical ability. She had enlisted in the Army at age 19, motivated more by the need for steady employment and educational benefits than by any particular calling to military service. Her initial aptitude tests had qualified her for several technical fields, but she had requested communication specifically because it seemed like a stable career path that would provide valuable civilian skills after her enlistment ended. During basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, Maria had performed competently but hadn't distinguished herself as a standout recruit. She completed physical fitness requirements without difficulty, but wasn't among the top performers. Her marksmanship scores were adequate for her military occupational specialty, but not exceptional. She followed orders, maintained her equipment properly, and graduated on schedule with her training class. Her drill sergeants remembered her as quiet, reliable, and unremarkable, exactly the kind of soldier who would be assigned to support roles rather than leadership positions. Advanced individual training at Fort Gordon had followed a similar pattern. Maria mastered the technical skills required for military communications, learned to operate standard radio equipment, and passed all required examinations. Her instructors noted that she seemed to grasp complex concepts quickly, but she rarely asked questions or sought additional information beyond what was required for course completion. She completed practical exercises efficiently and helped other students who were struggling with technical material, but she never volunteered for advanced training opportunities or expressed interest in specialized communications fields. What her instructors and fellow students didn't know was that Maria spent her off-duty hours in the base library, reading technical manuals that weren't part of the required curriculum. She studied frequency propagation theory, electromagnetic spectrum management, and historical communication systems used by military forces in previous conflicts. She borrowed books about radio technology from the 1940s through the 1980s, fascinated by how communications had evolved and what techniques had been abandoned as technology advanced. Her roommates assumed she was simply a dedicated student who wanted to excel in her chosen field. But Maria's interests went far deeper than career advancement. The truth was that Maria Santos had grown up surrounded by stories about military communications, though she had never shared this background with anyone in her unit. Her grandfather, whom she had never met, had been a radio operator during World War II and the Korean War. He had died when Maria was 3 years old, but her mother had kept boxes of his military memorabilia in their apartment closet. As a child, Maria had been fascinated by the old radio equipment, technical manuals, and logbooks that documented her grandfather's service. Her mother had explained that Grandfather Santos had been highly skilled at his job, able to establish communications in situations where others failed. But the details had always been vague. During her teenage years, Maria had taught herself basic electronics and radio theory, using her grandfather's old technical manuals and equipment she purchased at surplus stores. She had obtained an amateur radio license at age 16 and spent countless hours communicating with operators around the world, learning about frequency propagation, antenna design, and signal processing techniques that weren't taught in high school physics classes. Her mother had encouraged this hobby, viewing it as a positive way for Maria to connect with her grandfather's memory, but neither of them had realized how extensive Maria's knowledge was becoming. Now, as Maria adjusted the controls on her auxiliary radio equipment, she was drawing on years of self-directed study and practical experience that none of her colleagues suspected she possessed. The equipment she was using was older and simpler than the sophisticated systems that Rodriguez and Thompson operated, but Maria understood that simplicity could be an advantage when dealing with complex interference patterns. Modern military radios were designed to operate on specific frequencies using predetermined protocols, which made them efficient but also predictable. Older equipment had more flexibility and could be adapted for non-standard applications. "What exactly are you planning to do, Sergeant?" Thompson asked, his tone suggesting he was humoring a junior soldier rather than expecting the serious technical explanation. Maria continued making adjustments while she explained. "The enemy jamming is targeting frequencies and protocols that are currently in use by our forces. But military communications have evolved significantly over the decades, and there are frequency bands that were commonly used in previous conflicts, but aren't part of current doctrine." Rodriguez shook his head. "Those frequencies were abandoned for good reasons. They don't provide the security, clarity, or reliability that modern systems offer. Even if you could establish contact, how would you maintain secure communications without current encryption protocols?" Maria paused in her equipment adjustments and looked directly at Rodriguez. "Sir, the patrol doesn't need perfect security right now. They need any communications at all. Once we establish basic contact, we can coordinate more sophisticated solutions." Colonel Harrison watched this exchange with growing interest. He had noticed something that the communications specialists had missed. Maria Santos was speaking about frequency management and signal propagation with a level of technical understanding that seemed inconsistent with her training and experience level. Her explanations demonstrated knowledge that went beyond what was taught in standard military communications courses. Either she was bluffing with terminology she didn't really understand, or she possessed expertise that wasn't reflected in her personnel file. "Sergeant Santos," the colonel said, "where did you learn about historical frequency usage patterns? That's not typically covered in detail during initial communications training." Maria hesitated for a moment, realizing she had revealed more knowledge than a typical backup radio operator would possess. "Sir, I've done additional studying on my own time. I find the technical aspects of communications interesting, so I've read about how systems have evolved over time." Thompson snorted quietly. "Book learning is different from practical application, especially in combat conditions. These older frequencies and protocols weren't designed for current threat environments." Maria nodded respectfully but continued. "Working. You're correct, sir, but they also weren't designed to be defeated by current jamming techniques. Sometimes older solutions work precisely because they're not anticipated." As Maria spoke, she was implementing techniques that she had learned through years of amateur radio operation and historical research. She adjusted her transmitter to operate on a frequency that had been commonly used for tactical communications during the Vietnam War, but had been largely abandoned as military technology advanced. The frequency existed in a gap between current military allocations, technically available for use but not included in standard operating procedures. More importantly, it was outside the range of frequencies that the enemy jamming equipment was targeting, but frequency selection was only part of the challenge. Military communications required not just the ability to transmit and receive signals, but also the ability to identify friendly forces, coordinate complex operations, and maintain some level of security against enemy interception. The protocols and codes used on modern frequencies had been developed specifically to address these requirements. Using an older frequency meant abandoning much of this sophisticated infrastructure. Maria had anticipated this problem and had developed a potential solution during her months of preparation, though she hadn't expected to implement it under combat conditions. She had studied communication techniques used by resistance forces and special operations units who needed to establish contact using non-standard methods. These groups had developed informal protocols that could provide basic security and identification without requiring complex encryption systems. "I'm going to attempt contact using a modified version of techniques that were used by Special Forces units for behind-the-lines communications," Maria explained as she fine-tuned her equipment. "It won't provide the same level of security as our standard systems, but it should allow basic coordination and information exchange. Rodriguez looked skeptical. What makes you think the patrol will know how to respond using non-standard techniques? Maria smiled slightly. The first time anyone in the bunker had seen her display confidence rather than quiet determination. Because professional soldiers adapt to available resources. Sir, if they hear a clear signal coming from their base, they'll figure out how to communicate. She paused, then added, Captain Walsh has 15 years of experience. He's worked with communications equipment from multiple eras. If anyone can adapt to an alternative approach, it's him. Colonel Harrison found himself impressed by Maria's reasoning. She wasn't just proposing a technical solution. She was demonstrating strategic thinking about how to work with the capabilities and experience of the soldiers she was trying to reach. This level of tactical awareness was unusual for a soldier in a support position, especially one who had been in the unit for only 6 months. 0903 hours. Maria completed her equipment adjustments and prepared to attempt contact with the trapped patrol. The bunker fell silent except for the static from the main communication systems, which continued to demonstrate that conventional approaches were still failing. Rodriguez and Thompson watched with barely concealed skepticism, while Colonel Harrison and his staff observed with cautious hope. Maria adjusted her headset, checked her transmission settings one final time, and began her attempt to contact the patrol using techniques that hadn't been employed by regular military units in decades. Her voice was calm and professional as she transmitted, Desert Fox, this is home base calling on emergency frequency 7-7-.5-0. Please respond if you copy this transmission. Static filled the bunker for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. Rodriguez was beginning to formulate a tactful way to suggest that they return to conventional troubleshooting methods when a voice crackled through the static, faint but unmistakably clear. Home base, this is Desert Fox Actual. We copy your transmission and are standing by for instructions. How did you reach us on this frequency? The moment Captain Walsh's voice came through the auxiliary radio, the atmosphere in the communications bunker shifted from desperation to intense focus. But establishing basic contact was only the beginning of what would prove to be an extraordinarily complex challenge. Within seconds of the initial transmission, it became clear that the patrol situation was far more dire than anyone had initially understood. The intelligence they had gathered wasn't just important. It was time-critical information that needed to reach multiple command levels simultaneously while coordinating a rescue operation that would require precision timing across several military branches. Captain Walsh's first detailed report painted a picture of escalating crisis that demanded immediate multi-level response. The patrol had discovered that the enemy assault wasn't planned for the following day, as intelligence had suggested, but was already underway. 3 separate enemy columns were moving toward Allied positions, using routes that would allow them to bypass most defensive preparations. The first column was approaching a supply convoy that was completely unaware of the threat. The second column was positioning to attack a forward medical facility that housed wounded soldiers who couldn't be evacuated quickly. The third column was moving toward forward operating base Viper itself, using terrain features that would allow them to achieve tactical surprise. But the complexity extended far beyond simply relaying this information to higher command. The patrol's position had been compromised, and enemy forces were actively hunting them while simultaneously jamming all standard communications frequencies. Captain Walsh reported that his unit was taking sporadic fire from at least 2 directions, had 1 soldier with serious injuries requiring immediate medical evacuation, and was running low on ammunition after several hours of intermittent combat. They needed extraction immediately, but any rescue helicopter would be flying into an area with confirmed surface-to-air missile threats and limited visibility. Due to smoke from nearby explosions, Colonel Harrison quickly realized that resolving This crisis would require simultaneous coordination with division headquarters, Air Support Command, medical evacuation units, the threatened supply convoy, the forward medical facility, and multiple other allied units in the region. Each of these communications would need to occur on different frequencies using different protocols, and all of them would need to be coordinated precisely to prevent friendly fire incidents or tactical conflicts. Under normal circumstances, this level of coordination would require a full communications, staff working with sophisticated equipment and established procedures. The technical challenges were staggering. Division headquarters operated on encrypted frequencies that required specific authentication codes and signal protocols. Air Support Command used different frequency bands with their own security requirements and coordination procedures. Medical evacuation units operated on yet another set of frequencies and used medical emergency protocols that took priority over other military communications. The supply convoy was using standard tactical frequencies that were currently being jammed, while the forward medical facility was operating under communications restrictions designed to prevent enemy forces from targeting medical personnel, staff. Sergeant Rodriguez attempted to take over the coordination effort, assuming that establishing initial contact was the most difficult part and that routine procedures could handle the rest. He instructed Maria to maintain the connection with the patrol while he and Thompson worked to contact other units using standard channels. But within minutes, it became apparent that the conventional approach was failing catastrophically. Rodriguez couldn't establish contact with division headquarters because the same jamming that had initially blocked patrol communications was affecting all standard military frequencies. Thompson's attempts to reach Air Support Command resulted in intermittent connections that were too unreliable for coordinating precision airstrikes in an area with friendly forces. The situation became more complex when Captain Walsh reported that the patrol had identified specific targets that needed to be engaged immediately to prevent enemy forces from reaching their objectives. He transmitted detailed coordinates for enemy positions, but this information was useless unless it could be relayed quickly to units capable of engaging those targets. The patrol had observed enemy anti-aircraft positions that posed threats to any rescue helicopters, but this intelligence needed to reach Air Support Command within minutes to be actionable. They had also identified a command post that appeared to be coordinating the entire enemy operation, but eliminating it would require immediate airstrikes or artillery support. Rodriguez and Thompson worked frantically to establish the multiple connections required for effective coordination, but the technical obstacles proved insurmountable using conventional methods. The jamming interference wasn't uniform across all frequencies. It was sophisticated and adaptive, seeming to detect when Allied forces attempted to use backup channels, and then extending interference to those frequencies as well. Every time they established partial contact with one unit, the connection would degrade just as critical information was being transmitted. Authentication protocols that normally took seconds were taking minutes, and by the time secure connections were established, the tactical situation had changed enough to make the information obsolete. At 0917 hours, the crisis escalated further. When Captain Walsh reported that his patrol had come under direct attack from a significantly larger enemy force, the intermittent gunfire had intensified into sustained combat, and the patrol was being forced to move from their current position. This meant that all the target coordinates they had provided were becoming obsolete in real time, and any rescue operation would need to be redirected to a new location that wouldn't be determined until the patrol could establish a defensive position. The wounded soldier's condition was deteriorating, making medical evacuation even more urgent, but the tactical situation was making helicopter extraction increasingly dangerous. Colonel Harrison found himself facing the coordination challenge that would have been difficult under optimal conditions and was becoming impossible with degraded communications. The enemy assault was proceeding according to their timeline, while Allied forces were struggling to coordinate any effective response. The supply convoy was continuing toward an ambush because no one could establish reliable contact to warn them. The forward medical facility was operating without knowledge of the approaching threat. Air support units were standing by with aircraft and weapons ready, but they couldn't engage targets without proper coordination and authorization. Thompson attempted to compensate by using satellite communication systems that should have been immune to ground-based jamming, but these systems were experiencing their own technical difficulties. The sophisticated encryption and authentication protocols that made satellite communication secure also made them slow and inflexible when rapid coordination was required. Each connection attempt required multiple authorization steps, signal verification procedures, and protocol negotiations that consumed precious minutes. When connections were finally established, the bandwidth limitations of satellite systems made it difficult to transmit the detailed tactical information that commanders needed for decision-making. The mathematical complexity of the coordination problem was staggering. Each unit that needed to be contacted operated on different frequencies, with different protocols and different security requirements. The timing of each communication needed to be precisely coordinated to ensure that information was actionable. When it arrived, airstrikes needed to be timed to occur after friendly forces had moved to safe positions, but before enemy forces could relocate their equipment. Medical evacuation needed to be coordinated with suppressive fire to protect helicopters. During landing and takeoff, artillery support needed to be synchronized with ground movement to maximize effectiveness while minimizing the risk of friendly fire. Rodriguez calculated that establishing all the required communications using standard procedures would take, at minimum, 45 minutes, assuming that technical problems could be resolved and that enemy jamming didn't interfere with the process. But the tactical situation was evolving minute by minute, and information that was current when transmitted might be obsolete by the time it reached its destination. The patrol couldn't maintain their current position for 45 minutes under sustained enemy fire, and the enemy columns would reach their targets long before effective countermeasures could be coordinated. At 0925 hours, the situation reached a critical point when multiple crises began occurring simultaneously. Captain Walsh reported that the patrol was being forced to abandon their current position and move to terrain that would provide better defensive positions, but would also make radio communications more difficult. The supply convoy had stopped responding to communication attempts entirely, suggesting they might already be under attack. The forward medical facility requested immediate clarification about reports of enemy activity in their area, but no one could provide reliable information about the timing or direction of the potential threat. Colonel Harrison realized that conventional approaches to military communications were failing not because of equipment problems or personnel incompetence, but because the situation exceeded the parameters that standard procedures were designed to handle. Military communications doctrine assumed that most coordination would occur through established command structures using predetermined frequencies and protocols. But this crisis required rapid, flexible coordination across multiple command structures, using whatever communication methods were available. The base commander found himself considering options that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. He could authorize units to engage targets without proper coordination, accepting the risk of friendly fire incidents in exchange for rapid response. He could order the supply convoy to change course without providing specific threat information, potentially saving lives but also potentially disrupting critical logistics operations. He could request immediate airstrikes on suspected enemy positions without proper target verification, potentially eliminating threats but also potentially causing civilian casualties. Each of these options carried serious risks and potential consequences that could affect not just the immediate tactical situation, but also broader strategic objectives and international relations. Military commanders were trained to make difficult decisions under pressure, but they were also expected to follow established procedures that had been developed to minimize risks and ensure accountability. The communications breakdown was forcing Colonel Harrison to choose between following proper procedures and responding effectively to an evolving crisis. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez made one final attempt to establish communications using standard equipment and procedures, working with Thompson to simultaneously contact multiple units using different radio systems. They managed to establish partial contact with 3 different command elements, but none of the connections were reliable enough for detailed coordination. Static interference degraded voice communications to the point where complex tactical information couldn't be transmitted accurately. Authentication protocols failed repeatedly, preventing the establishment of secure channels for sensitive information. By 0932 hours, it had become clear that conventional military communications were inadequate for the complexity and urgency of the current crisis. The patrol remained under fire in an uncertain location. The supply convoy's status was unknown. The forward medical facility was requesting guidance that no one could provide. Air support units were standing by with no clear targets or authorization. Multiple enemy columns were advancing toward their objectives, while Allied forces struggled to coordinate any effective response. Colonel Harrison turned to Maria Santos, who had maintained the only reliable communications link throughout the entire crisis. The young sergeant had been quietly monitoring the situation while the senior communications specialists attempted to resolve the technical problems using conventional methods. Her auxiliary radio equipment continued to provide clear contact with the patrol, but everyone understood that a single communication link was insufficient for the level of coordination that the situation demanded. "Sergeant Santos," Colonel Harrison said, his voice cutting through the tension in the bunker, "you've maintained the only functional communication we have with the patrol. What would you need to coordinate the entire operation from your position?" The question hung in the air like a challenge and an opportunity simultaneously. Rodriguez looked up sharply from his malfunctioning equipment, clearly surprised that the base commander was asking a backup radio operator to assume responsibility for a complex multi-unit coordination effort that would normally require a full communications staff. Maria felt every pair of eyes in the bunker focusing on her, but she had been preparing for this moment throughout the entire crisis. While the senior technicians had been struggling with sophisticated equipment and standard procedures, she had been analyzing the communication requirements and developing a mental framework for how alternative approaches might succeed where conventional methods were failing. Her amateur radio background had taught her that complex communications challenges often required creative solutions that prioritized effectiveness over adherence to established protocols. "Sir, I would need authorization to use non-standard frequencies and improvised protocols across multiple communication channels simultaneously," Maria replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "The enemy jamming is effective against our current systems because it's designed to target specific frequency bands and protocol structures. But if we can establish a network using frequencies and methods they're not prepared to counter, we might be able to coordinate the entire operation." Thompson shook his head skeptically. "Sergeant, you're talking about coordinating division headquarters, air support command, medical evacuation units, artillery support, and multiple field units simultaneously. That requires sophisticated equipment, secure protocols, and years of experience managing complex military communications. You're proposing to do it with auxiliary equipment and improvised methods." His tone suggested he viewed Maria's proposal as well-intentioned, but hopelessly naive. Colonel Harrison studied Maria's face, looking for signs of overconfidence or uncertainty that might indicate she was overestimating her capabilities. What he saw instead was calm assessment and measured confidence. the expression of someone who understood the complexity of what she was proposing, but believed she could execute it successfully. Explain your approach, Sergeant. How exactly would you establish and maintain multiple communication channels using non-standard methods? Maria moved to a tactical map of the region and began outlining her strategy. Sir, the key is understanding that different types of communications have different requirements and can be handled using different approaches. The patrol needs immediate tactical coordination, which requires clear, real-time voice communication, but doesn't necessarily need the highest level of security. Division headquarters needs detailed intelligence reports, which can be transmitted using slower but more reliable methods. Air Support Command needs precise target coordinates and timing information, which can be handled using compressed data. Transmission techniques. She pointed to different locations on the map as she continued. By using multiple auxiliary radio systems, operating on different frequencies with different protocols, we can create a communication network that provides each unit with the type of connection that best serves their specific requirements. The enemy jamming can't cover every possible frequency simultaneously, especially if we're using frequency bands that aren't normally employed for military communications. Rodriguez interrupted. Even if you could establish multiple connections, how would you manage the coordination requirements? Airstrikes need to be timed with ground movements. Medical evacuation needs to be synchronized with suppressive fire. Artillery support needs to be coordinated to avoid friendly fire. You're talking about managing dozens of variables simultaneously, while maintaining communications with multiple units that are operating under combat conditions. Maria nodded respectfully. Sir, you're absolutely correct about the complexity. But the current approach isn't working at all, which means that perfect coordination is impossible regardless of our methods. What I'm proposing is functional coordination. That allows units to operate effectively, even if it doesn't meet all the standards we would prefer under optimal conditions. She paused, then added, sometimes adequate coordination that actually works is better than perfect coordination that never gets implemented. The base commander found himself facing a decision that would have seemed impossible an hour earlier. Military doctrine emphasized following established procedures, using approved equipment, and maintaining clear command structures. What Maria Santos was proposing violated multiple aspects of standard operating procedures and would place critical military operations under the control of a junior, enlisted soldier with minimal official experience. But conventional approaches had failed completely, time was running out, and soldiers' lives were at stake. What specific equipment and authorizations would you need? Colonel Harrison asked, his question indicating he was seriously considering Maria's proposal. Rodriguez and Thompson exchanged concerned glances, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of deviating so far from established procedures, but neither could offer alternative solutions that showed any promise of success. Maria had anticipated this question and had already identified the resources she would need. Sir, I would need access to all available radio equipment in the bunker, including systems that are normally used for different purposes. I would need authorization to transmit on frequencies that aren't currently allocated for this operation. And I would need permission to use communication protocols that aren't in our standard playbook. She looked directly at Colonel Harrison. Most importantly, I would need authorization to make real-time coordination decisions without requiring approval through normal command channels. The request for independent decision-making authority was the most significant aspect of what Maria was proposing. Military operations depended on clear command structures and approval processes that ensured accountability and prevented unauthorized actions. What she was asking for was essentially the authority to function as a communications coordinator with the power to direct multiple military units in real time based on her assessment of tactical requirements. Thompson voiced the concern that everyone in the bunker was thinking. Sir, If we authorize Sergeant Santos to coordinate this operation using improvised methods, we're placing responsibility for multiple units and potentially hundreds of lives in the hands of someone who doesn't have the experience or official qualifications for that level of responsibility. If something goes wrong, the consequences could be catastrophic. Colonel Harrison weighed these concerns against the reality of their current situation. Standard procedures had failed completely. Time was running out for the trap patrol, and enemy forces were advancing toward their objectives, while Allied units remained unable to coordinate an effective response. The choice wasn't between a safe conventional approach and a risky improvised approach. It was between an improvised approach that might work and no effective approach at all. At 0938 hours, with explosions continuing to shake the base and reports of enemy activity increasing throughout the region, Colonel Harrison made his decision. Sergeant Santos, you have my authorization to attempt coordination of this operation using whatever methods you believe will be effective. You have access to all communication equipment in this bunker and authority to transmit on any frequencies you deem necessary. You also have authorization to make real-time coordination decisions for all units involved in this operation. He paused, looking directly at Maria, but understand that this authorization comes with complete responsibility for the outcomes. If your methods succeed, you'll have saved dozens of lives and prevented a strategic disaster. If they fail, the consequences will be severe for everyone involved. Maria met his gaze steadily. I understand, sir. I won't let you down. Rodriguez and Thompson stepped back from their equipment, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but recognizing that their commanding officer had made a decision that needed their support. Maria moved quickly to begin implementing her alternative approach, knowing that every minute of delay reduced the chances of success and increased the danger to soldiers, who were depending on her ability to coordinate their rescue and the defense of Allied positions. Maria moved to the bank of radio equipment with a fluidity that immediately caught Colonel Harrison's attention. Instead of the hesitant movements he expected from a junior soldier, suddenly thrust into an overwhelming situation, she began working with the systematic precision of someone who had performed these actions countless times before. Her hands moved across the controls of multiple radio systems simultaneously, adjusting frequencies and signal strengths with muscle memory that seemed inconsistent with her official training and experience level. She began by reconfiguring 3 separate radio systems to operate on frequencies that hadn't been used by military forces in the region for over 2 decades. Her fingers found controls and settings that Rodriguez and Thompson would have needed technical manuals to locate, adjusting each system for optimal performance on frequency bands that weren't covered in contemporary communications training. The speed and confidence of her movements suggested familiarity with radio equipment that went far beyond what she should have acquired during 6 months at Forward Operating Base Viper. Desert Fox, this is home base establishing coordination network. Maria transmitted to the patrol while simultaneously preparing additional radio systems for contact with other units. I'm going to relay your position and intelligence to multiple command levels simultaneously. Continue to update me on your tactical situation every 2 minutes. Captain Walsh's response was immediate and clear, confirming that the alternative frequency was providing reliable communication despite the ongoing jamming of standard military channels. Maria's next action surprised everyone in the bunker. She began transmitting on a second frequency using techniques that combined elements from different historical communication protocols, creating a hybrid approach that provided basic security while maintaining the flexibility needed for rapid coordination. Her knowledge of these protocols was precise and detailed, suggesting study that went far beyond casual interest in communications history. She established contact with division headquarters using authentication methods that were technically valid but hadn't been employed in routine operations for years. The conversation with division headquarters revealed another layer of Maria's unexpected competence. When the duty officer questioned her authority to coordinate the operation and requested standard authentication procedures, Maria responded with knowledge of emergency protocols and command structures that demonstrated understanding of military operations beyond her apparent rank and position. She provided authentication information that satisfied headquarters, personnel, and established her credibility as a legitimate coordinator for the developing crisis. While maintaining these two communication channels, Maria simultaneously began working with a third radio system to contact Air Support Command. Her approach to this communication was different again, using frequency bands and signal modulation techniques that were optimized for air-to-ground coordination. The technical expertise required to adapt different radio systems for their optimal applications wasn't taught in standard military communications courses. Yet Maria implemented these adaptations without hesitation or reference to technical documentation. Rodriguez watched in growing amazement as Maria coordinated information flow between multiple units using communication methods he didn't recognize, but that were clearly effective. She was providing the patrol with real-time updates about incoming air support while simultaneously relaying intelligence about enemy positions to division headquarters and coordinating target priorities with Air Support Command. The level of multitasking and situational awareness she was demonstrating exceeded what most experienced communications specialists could maintain under routine conditions, let alone during a complex crisis that the physical demands of coordinating multiple radio systems simultaneously required movements and coordination that revealed additional aspects of Maria's hidden background. She operated different pieces of equipment with both hands while monitoring multiple channels through headphones that she adjusted periodically to maintain optimal audio clarity. Her posture and hand position suggested familiarity with radio equipment that came from extensive practical experience rather than classroom training. Thompson noticed that Maria was making adjustments to signal strength and frequency modulation that optimized each radio system for its specific communication requirements. The technical knowledge required for these optimizations included understanding of atmospheric propagation, interference patterns, and equipment capabilities that wasn't covered in basic military communications training. She was adapting her approach in real time based on signal quality and tactical requirements, demonstrating problem-solving skills that typically developed only after years of experience with diverse communication challenges. At 0947 hours, Maria achieved something that had seemed impossible when the crisis began. She had established reliable communication with the trapped patrol, division headquarters, Air Support Command, and medical evacuation units simultaneously using 4 different radio systems operating on different frequencies with different protocols. Each communication channel was providing the specific type of coordination that each unit required for effective operations, and information was flowing in real time between units that had been completely unable to coordinate their activities. Using standard military communications, the tactical coordination that Maria was managing became increasingly complex as she began synchronizing actions between multiple units. She was providing Air Support Command with updated target coordinates from the patrol while simultaneously coordinating timing with artillery units to ensure that suppressive fire would be available when medical evacuation helicopters approached. The patrol's position, the level of detail and precision in her coordination exceeded what most communications specialists could manage using sophisticated equipment and established procedures. Colonel Harrison found himself watching Maria's performance with growing recognition that he was witnessing capabilities that couldn't be explained by her official background and training. Her understanding of military operations, communication protocols, and tactical coordination suggested experience and education that weren't reflected in her personnel file. She was making decisions about timing, priorities, and resource allocation That required knowledge of how different military units operated and how their capabilities could be integrated for maximum effectiveness. Preparing and narrating. This type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The breakthrough moment came at 0952 hours when Maria successfully coordinated a complex multi-unit operation that required precise timing and flawless communication. She directed airstrikes against enemy positions to create a diversion while simultaneously coordinating ground movement by the patrol to a position suitable for helicopter extraction. Artillery fire was timed to provide suppressive fire during helicopter approach and departure, while medical personnel were prepared to treat the wounded soldier immediately. Upon arrival at the base, the success of this coordination was immediately apparent as reports came in from multiple units, confirming that the operation was proceeding exactly as planned. The patrol was moving to the extraction point under cover of coordinated supporting fire. Airstrikes were eliminating enemy positions that threatened Allied units. Medical evacuation was proceeding on schedule with proper security coordination. The enemy assault on Allied positions was being disrupted by accurate intelligence and coordinated countermeasures. By 0955 hours, the communications crisis that had seemed insurmountable an hour earlier had been resolved through Maria's alternative approach to military coordination. But the successful resolution of the immediate crisis was less significant than the demonstration of capabilities that couldn't be explained by her apparent background and training. Everyone in the bunker realized they had witnessed performance that suggested Maria Santos was not who she appeared to be. The successful extraction of the patrol at 10:15 hours marked the end of the immediate crisis, but it was only the beginning of deeper questions about how Maria Santos had accomplished what experienced communications specialists could not. Colonel Harrison ordered a detailed debriefing of the operation, ostensibly to document successful alternative communication procedures for future reference, but primarily to understand how a backup radio operator had demonstrated capabilities. That seemed impossible given her official background and training. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to voice what everyone in the bunker was thinking. "Sir, what Sergeant Santos accomplished today wasn't just creative problem solving. She used communication techniques and equipment modifications that aren't taught in any current military training program. Her knowledge of frequency management, protocol adaptation, and tactical coordination exceeds what you'd expect from someone with years of specialized experience." His tone carried respect mixed with confusion about what he had witnessed. Thompson added his own observations. The technical modifications she made to the radio equipment required understanding of signal propagation theory and electromagnetic spectrum management that's typically only taught to communications officers with advanced technical degrees. She was making real-time adjustments based on atmospheric conditions and interference patterns that most enlisted specialists wouldn't even recognize, let alone know how to compensate for. Colonel Harrison had been conducting informal investigations throughout his career, and he recognized the signs of someone operating with knowledge and capabilities that exceeded their apparent background. Maria's performance suggested training and experience that couldn't have been acquired through standard military channels, at least not recently. Someone had taught her advanced communication techniques, and that training had been thorough enough to enable her to coordinate complex military operations under combat conditions. "Sergeant Santos," Colonel Harrison said, "I need you to explain where you acquired the technical knowledge and practical experience that enabled you to coordinate today's operation. Your personnel file doesn't reflect training or experience that would account for your performance." His tone was direct but not accusatory. He was seeking information rather than challenging her authority to have acted as she did. Maria had been anticipating this moment throughout the crisis, knowing that her actions would inevitably raise questions about her background that she had been carefully avoiding since her arrival at Forward Operating Base Viper. She looked around the bunker at the faces of soldiers who had witnessed her performance, recognizing that continuing to conceal her background was no longer possible or appropriate. "Sir, my technical knowledge comes from years of informal training that began when I was a child," Maria began, choosing her words carefully. "My grandfather served as a communications specialist during World War II, Korea, and the early years of Vietnam. After his military service, he continued working with radio technology and taught me everything he knew about communication systems and techniques." Rodriguez looked skeptical. "Sergeant, most World War II veterans didn't have access to the kind of advanced knowledge you demonstrated today. Radio technology from that era was much simpler than current systems, and the tactical coordination requirements were different. How would training from your grandfather account for your understanding of modern equipment and contemporary military operations?" Maria hesitated, recognizing that she was approaching information that she had never shared with anyone in her unit. "Sir, my grandfather wasn't just any communications specialist. His name was Master Sergeant Carlos Santos, and he was one of the primary developers of advanced military communication techniques during the Cold War period. He worked on classified projects involving frequency management, signal security, and tactical coordination that weren't declassified until years after his death." The name Carlos Santos triggered recognition in Colonel Harrison's memory. He recalled reading historical documents about communications development during the 1960s and 1970s that had mentioned a Master Sergeant Santos who had contributed to significant advances in military radio technology. But those documents had also mentioned controversy surrounding Santos's work and questions about his loyalty that had never been fully resolved. "Your grandfather was Carlos Santos?" Colonel Harrison asked, his tone indicating that the name carried significance beyond what Maria had initially implied. "The communications specialist whose work on frequency hopping and secure transmission protocols became the foundation for modern military radio systems." Maria nodded, unsurprised that Colonel Harrison recognized the name and its historical importance. Thompson's expression changed as he absorbed this information. "If your grandfather was Carlos Santos, then your technical knowledge makes much more sense. But didn't Master Sergeant Santos leave the military under controversial circumstances? I remember reading something about questions regarding his security clearance and access to classified information." His comment reflected knowledge of historical events that suggested Carlos Santos's military career had ended in dispute rather than honor. Maria's demeanor shifted, revealing the emotional weight that these questions carried for her. "My grandfather's military career ended in 1975 when he was accused of sharing classified communication techniques with unauthorized personnel. The investigation concluded that he had provided technical information to foreign contacts, and he was discharged from the military with loss of all benefits and security clearances." Her voice carried pain that she had been concealing throughout her military service. The historical context began clarifying the deeper significance of Maria's performance during the communications crisis. If Carlos Santos had been unjustly accused of disloyalty, then his granddaughter's demonstration of extraordinary competence using his techniques carried implications beyond the immediate tactical situation. Maria's success proved that Carlos Santos's methods were not only legitimate, but potentially superior to current military communication approaches. Colonel Harrison consulted his personal knowledge of military history, recalling details about the Carlos Santos case that had been discussed in communications training programs as an example of security breaches during the Cold War period. The official record showed that Santos had been caught sharing advanced radio techniques with individuals who weren't authorized to receive such information, leading to his discharge and the classification of his work to prevent further security violations. "Sergeant Santos," Colonel Harrison said carefully, "if your grandfather taught you the techniques you use today, and those techniques were classified because of security concerns, How do you reconcile your use of that knowledge with current military security requirements? His question addressed the fundamental issue of whether Maria's actions, however successful, had involved unauthorized use of classified information. Maria had prepared for this question throughout her years of training and her months of military service. Sir, my grandfather's techniques were never actually classified because they represented security risks. They were classified because they challenged existing approaches to military communications and threatened the careers of people who had invested in different technologies and methods. The accusation of disloyalty was a way to discredit his work without having to address its technical merits. This assertion carried significant implications for understanding both historical events and current military communications doctrine. If Carlos Santos had been wrongly accused, then his discharge represented an injustice that had prevented the military from benefiting from potentially superior communication techniques. Maria's successful use of those techniques during the current crisis provided evidence that her grandfather's work had legitimate military value. The pieces of a complex historical puzzle were beginning to align in ways that transformed Maria's individual achievement into evidence of broader institutional failures. Her exceptional performance wasn't just personal success. It was vindication of her grandfather's work and implicit criticism of the decision-making that had led to his disgrace and discharge from military service decades earlier. Colonel Harrison returned to his office that evening and accessed classified military archives that he hadn't consulted in years, searching for the complete record of the Carlos Santos case from 1975. What he discovered in the declassified documents painted a picture of institutional failure and personal injustice that had been buried for nearly 5 decades. The official investigation file revealed that Master Sergeant Carlos Santos hadn't been sharing classified information with foreign contacts. He had been collaborating with allied military communication specialists to develop improved techniques for joint operations. The accusations against Carlos Santos had originated from a competing research group within the military communications establishment that was developing alternative approaches to radio technology. When Santos's frequency hopping techniques proved superior to their methods during comparative testing, members of the competing group had initiated a security investigation alleging that Santos's innovations were suspiciously advanced and suggested access to foreign technical sources. The investigation had been conducted by personnel who lacked the technical expertise to evaluate Santos's work objectively and who had professional incentives to discredit his achievements. Documentary evidence in the classified files showed that Santos had repeatedly requested formal review of his techniques through proper channels, seeking official recognition and implementation of methods that could significantly improve military communications effectiveness. His requests had been delayed, redirected, and ultimately ignored by supervisors who were invested in alternative approaches and who viewed Santos's work as threatening to their own careers and research programs. When Santos began sharing his techniques with allied personnel during joint training exercises, his actions were characterized as unauthorized disclosure rather than legitimate military cooperation. The most damning evidence in the files was a series of memoranda between senior communications officers, acknowledging that Santos's techniques were technically superior to existing methods, but expressing concern that adopting his innovations would require admitting that current doctrine was inadequate. One memorandum explicitly stated that discrediting Santos personally was preferable to acknowledging institutional failures in communications development. The security investigation had been initiated not to protect classified information, but to eliminate a source of embarrassment for military leadership. Maria had spent years researching these same documents after they were declassified through Freedom of Information Act requests, gradually piecing together the truth about her grandfather's case. She had discovered that Carlos Santos had documented his techniques meticulously, creating detailed technical manuals and training Materials that proved his methods were original innovations rather than foreign intelligence. These documents had been classified and buried in military archives, preventing anyone from verifying Santos's claims of innocence or recognizing the value of his contributions to communications technology. The personal cost of the injustice had been devastating. For the Santos family, Carlos Santos had been stripped of his military pension and benefits, making it impossible for him to support his family or continue his technical work in civilian employment. Security clearance revocation had prevented him from working in any field related to communications or electronics, forcing him to take manual labor jobs that didn't utilize his expertise. The stress and humiliation of the false accusations had contributed to health problems that led to his death in 1987 at the age of 58. 12 years after his discharge from military service, Maria's mother had grown up in poverty because of her father's destroyed career, working multiple jobs to support herself and eventually to raise Maria as a single parent. The family had lived with the stigma of Carlos Santos's alleged disloyalty, unable to discuss his military service or technical achievements because doing so only reminded people of the accusations that had ended his career. Maria had learned about her grandfather's work in secret, studying his preserved technical documents and gradually understanding that he had been wronged by people who prioritized institutional protection over truth and justice. The connection between Carlos Santos's techniques and Maria's performance during the communications crisis was unmistakable to anyone who understood the technical details. The frequency management methods she had used were direct applications of her grandfather's innovations from the 1970s, adapted for contemporary equipment, but fundamentally unchanged in their theoretical foundations. The tactical coordination approaches she had employed reflected Santos's understanding of how communications could be optimized for specific military requirements rather than standardized for administrative convenience. Colonel Harrison realized that Maria's demonstration hadn't been random problem-solving under pressure. It had been a carefully planned vindication of her grandfather's work, timed to occur when the failure of conventional methods would highlight the superiority of Carlos Santos's suppressed innovations. She had positioned herself as a backup radio operator specifically to gain access to communications equipment and operational situations that would allow her to prove her grandfather's techniques were not only legitimate but superior to current military doctrine. The implications extended far beyond the Santos family's personal vindication. If Carlos Santos's techniques were superior to current methods, then the military had been operating with inferior communications capabilities for decades because institutional politics had prevented the adoption of better approaches. The successful resolution of the current crisis demonstrated that lives could have been saved and operations could have been more effective if Santos's work had been properly evaluated and implemented rather than suppressed to protect careers and reputations. Evidence in the classified files also revealed that other communications specialists had been similarly discredited when their innovations challenged established doctrine or threatened existing power structures. The Carlos Santos case wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of institutional behavior that prioritized conformity and hierarchy over technical excellence and operational effectiveness. Maria's grandfather had been one of several victims of a system that punished innovation and rewarded compliance with inadequate standards. The evening's research confirmed what Maria had suspected throughout her years of preparation. Her grandfather had been innocent of the charges that destroyed his career, and his technical contributions had been suppressed not because they represented security risks but because they represented challenges to institutional mediocrity. The communications crisis had provided her with the opportunity to demonstrate the value of his work while simultaneously proving the inadequacy of the methods that had replaced his innovations. The following morning, Colonel Harrison convened an emergency meeting with his senior staff and initiated contact with the Army's Historical Review Board. a department responsible for investigating cases where military personnel may have been wrongly accused or improperly disciplined. His official request for review included copies of the declassified documents from the Carlos Santos case, along with detailed technical reports documenting Maria's successful use of Santos's communication techniques during the recent crisis. The request emphasized that new evidence had emerged suggesting a significant historical injustice that required immediate institutional response. Within hours, the Historical Review Board had escalated the Santos case to the Secretary of the Army's office, recognizing that the implications extended far beyond correcting an individual injustice. If Carlos Santos had been wrongly discharged, and if his suppressed techniques were superior to current military communications doctrine, then the case represented systemic institutional failures that had potentially compromised military effectiveness for decades. The Review Board immediately classified the Santos investigation as priority status, authorizing resources and personnel, typically reserved for cases with national security implications. The technical analysis of Maria's performance during the communications crisis provided compelling evidence that Carlos Santos's methods were not only legitimate, but significantly more effective than current approaches. Military communications experts who reviewed the operations documentation confirmed that Maria had coordinated complex multi-unit operations, using techniques that exceeded the capabilities of standard equipment and procedures. Her success in establishing reliable communications, despite sophisticated enemy jamming, demonstrated practical applications of frequency management and signal processing theories that weren't fully understood by contemporary communications specialists. Independent verification of Carlos Santos's original technical documents revealed innovations that had been decades ahead of their time and remained relevant to current military communications challenges. His frequency hopping algorithms were more sophisticated than methods currently used in military radio systems. His approaches to signal security and interference resistance incorporated theoretical concepts that had only recently been rediscovered by civilian researchers. His tactical coordination protocols addressed operational requirements that current doctrine handled inadequately or ignored entirely. The reinvestigation of the 1975 security allegations against Carlos Santos uncovered evidence of deliberate falsification that had been concealed for nearly 50 years. Witness statements that had been used to support the accusations were found to contain contradictions and inconsistencies that should have been obvious to competent investigators. Technical evaluations that had concluded Santos's work was suspiciously advanced were revealed to have been conducted by personnel who lacked the expertise to understand the innovations they were assessing. Authentication of documents supposedly proving Santos's contact with foreign sources showed that key evidence had been fabricated or deliberately misinterpreted. The most significant discovery was a series of suppressed communications between Carlos Santos and his commanding officers, proving that he had repeatedly sought proper authorization for his collaboration with allied personnel and had been explicitly encouraged to share techniques that would improve joint military operations. The security investigation had characterized these authorized activities as evidence of disloyalty, creating a false narrative that portrayed legitimate military cooperation as treason. The suppressed communications proved that Santos had followed proper procedures and had been betrayed by superiors who later denied having authorized his actions. Maria received official notification of her grandfather's exoneration on a Tuesday morning that began like any other day but ended with the restoration of her family's honor and reputation. The formal letter from the Secretary of the Army acknowledged that Master Sergeant Carlos Santos had been wrongly accused, improperly investigated, and unjustly discharged from military service. His military record was ordered restored with full honors, including recognition of his technical contributions to military communications development. The letter also authorized retroactive payment of pension and benefits that had been denied to his family for 48 years. The emotional impact of official vindication was overwhelming for Maria, who had spent her entire adult life working toward this moment without knowing whether justice would ever be achieved. The letter represented not just correction of historical records, acknowledgement that her grandfather had been a patriot and innovator whose work had been suppressed by people who prioritized personal interests over military effectiveness. The shame and stigma that had shadowed her family for decades were replaced by recognition that Carlos Santos had been ahead of his time. Rather than disloyal to his country, the institutional response to the Santos case extended far beyond individual vindication to include systematic review of military communications doctrine and historical investigation practices. The Army Communications Command ordered comprehensive evaluation of current techniques compared to Carlos Santos's suppressed innovations, leading to recognition that significant improvements in military communications effectiveness could be achieved by implementing methods that had been available for decades. The Historical Review Board initiated broader investigation of other cases where technical innovations might have been suppressed for institutional rather than security reasons. Media coverage of the Santos vindication triggered public discussion about institutional accountability and the treatment of military personnel who challenged established practices. Veterans organizations praised the Army's willingness to acknowledge historical mistakes while expressing concern about how many other cases of institutional injustice might remain unresolved. Academic researchers requested access to Carlos Santos's technical documents, recognizing their potential value for contemporary communications, research and development. The ripple effects of the Santos case began appearing in military training programs where the story became a case study in the importance of evaluating technical innovations objectively rather than dismissing them because they challenged existing approaches. Communications specialists throughout the military began studying Santos's techniques, leading to rapid implementation of improvements that enhanced operational effectiveness across multiple commands. The case demonstrated that institutional humility and willingness to acknowledge mistakes could lead to significant improvements in military capabilities. Maria found herself transformed from an anonymous backup radio operator to a recognized expert whose demonstration of her grandfather's techniques had triggered fundamental changes in military communications practices. But rather than seeking recognition or career advancement, she began preparing for the next phase of her mission, ensuring that Carlos Santos's complete body of work would be preserved, studied, and implemented to prevent future suppression of valuable innovations. 3 weeks after the official vindication of Carlos Santos, Maria submitted a formal request for discharge from military service, citing completion of personal objectives rather than career dissatisfaction or family obligations. Her request surprised Colonel Harrison and her fellow communications specialists, who had expected her to leverage her newfound recognition into rapid promotion and assignment to advanced technical positions. The Army Communications Command had already offered her opportunities for specialized training, officer candidate school, and positions with prestigious units that would have provided excellent career advancement for someone with her demonstrated capabilities. Maria declined all offers for interviews with military publications that wanted to document her story and her grandfather's vindication. Defense contractors approached her with lucrative job offers, recognizing that someone who understood both historical and contemporary communications technology could provide valuable expertise for developing next-generation military radio systems. Academic institutions offered her research positions and full scholarships for advanced degrees in communications engineering. She politely refused every opportunity, explaining simply that her objectives had been achieved and that she preferred to return to civilian life. The decision to leave the military immediately after achieving her grandfather's vindication puzzled many people who had witnessed her exceptional performance during the communications crisis. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had initially been skeptical of Maria's capabilities, found himself genuinely disappointed that such talented personnel was choosing to leave military service just when her expertise could contribute most significantly to improving communications doctrine and training programs. He had developed professional respect for Maria's abilities and personal admiration for her dedication to clearing her grandfather's name. Thompson approached Maria privately to express his appreciation for what she had accomplished and to ask whether she might reconsider her decision to leave the military. He acknowledged that his initial skepticism had been wrong and that her performance had taught him valuable lessons about the importance of remaining open to alternative approaches and innovative thinking. He also admitted that witnessing her vindication of Carlos Santos had made him more aware of how institutional biases could prevent recognition of valuable contributions from unexpected sources. Colonel Harrison attempted to persuade Maria to remain in military service by offering her assignment to positions where she could implement her grandfather's techniques on a broader scale and ensure that his innovations would be properly integrated into military communications doctrine. He emphasized that her unique knowledge of Carlos Santos's work made her irreplaceable for overseeing the institutional changes that her grandfather's vindication had triggered. He also pointed out that remaining in military service would allow her to prevent future cases where technical innovations might be suppressed for institutional rather than security reasons. Maria appreciated these offers and the recognition they represented, but her response revealed that her motivations had always been focused on justice rather than career advancement or institutional reform. She explained that her years of preparation and military service had been dedicated to a specific objective: proving her grandfather's innocence and restoring his reputation. With that objective achieved, she had no desire to build a career based on the recognition she had earned through correcting historical injustice. The nature of Maria's departure from Forward Operating Base Viper reflected the same quiet professionalism that had characterized her performance during the communications crisis. She completed all required out-processing procedures, transferred responsibility for her equipment and duties to replacement personnel, and prepared detailed documentation of the alternative communication techniques she had used during the emergency. Her documentation was thorough and clear, designed to ensure that other communication specialists could implement Carlos Santos's methods without requiring her personal instruction or ongoing support. On her final day at the base, Maria left behind a single letter addressed to Colonel Harrison, expressing gratitude for the opportunity to serve and for his willingness to authorize the unconventional approach that had resolved the communications crisis. The letter also included recommendations for implementing her grandfather's techniques in military training programs and suggestions for preventing future suppression of technical innovations. She emphasized that the most important lesson from the Santos case was the need for institutional humility and willingness to evaluate ideas based on their merit rather than their source. Military personnel who had worked with Maria during her 6 months at Forward Operating Base Viper found themselves struggling to reconcile her quiet, unremarkable presence during routine operations with her extraordinary performance during the crisis and her subsequent decision to leave military service. Many admitted that they had never suspected she possessed the knowledge and capabilities she had demonstrated, leading to reflection about how easily exceptional personnel could be overlooked when they didn't conform to expected patterns of achievement and recognition seeking. The story of Maria Santos and her grandfather's vindication began spreading through military communications communities, but Maria herself had disappeared from public view. Attempts to contact her through official channels revealed that she had provided no forwarding address and had declined to maintain any connection with military or defense industry organizations. Her discharge paperwork indicated plans to pursue civilian employment, but no specific information about location or career intentions. Veterans, organizations, and historical societies attempted to locate Maria for speaking engagements and documentary projects about the Carlos Santos case, but she had effectively vanished from public accessibility. The mystery surrounding her post-military activities only enhanced the respect and curiosity that her story had generated. People who had witnessed her performance or learned about her grandfather's vindication found themselves wondering about her current activities and whether she might be working on other projects to correct historical injustices or implement suppressed innovations. The legend of Maria Santos began growing precisely because she had chosen to avoid the recognition and career opportunities that her achievements had made available. Her decision to leave military service immediately after accomplishing her objective demonstrated that her motivations had been genuinely focused on principle rather than personal advancement, creating lasting respect for someone who had achieved remarkable success and then quietly disappeared rather than capitalizing on her newfound fame. 2 years after Maria Santos disappeared from military service, the changes triggered by her grandfather's vindication had transformed military communications, training, and doctrine across multiple branches of the armed forces. The Army Communications School at Fort Gordon established the Carlos Santos Innovation Laboratory, where communications specialists studied historical techniques alongside contemporary technology to identify suppressed innovations that could improve current military capabilities. The laboratory's research revealed dozens of technical approaches that had been abandoned or forgotten due to institutional biases rather than technical limitations. The Santos Protocol became standard procedure for evaluating technical innovations that challenged existing doctrine. Named after both Carlos and Maria Santos, the protocol required objective technical evaluation of proposed improvements, regardless of their source or their challenge to established practices. The protocol included safeguards against the institutional pressures that had led to Carlos Santos's wrongful discharge, ensuring that technical merit rather than political considerations determined the fate of military innovations. Implementation of the Santos Protocol led to adoption of communication techniques that significantly improved military effectiveness in subsequent operations. The Historical Review Board expanded its investigation beyond the Santos case to examine other instances where military personnel might have been wrongly accused or discharged for challenging institutional practices. The board discovered patterns similar to the Santos case, where innovative personnel had been discredited when their work threatened existing power structures or challenged inadequate doctrine. Within 18 months, the board had reopened 47 cases involving personnel who had been discharged under suspicious circumstances related to technical disagreements or innovative proposals. Veterans organizations reported increasing contact from families of former military personnel who believed their relatives had been wrongly accused of disloyalty, incompetence, or insubordination when they had actually been challenging inadequate practices or proposing improvements. The Carlos Santos case had provided a framework for understanding how institutional bias could be disguised as security concerns or disciplinary actions. Families who had lived with shame and stigma for decades began seeking vindication. For relatives who had been silenced or discredited for speaking truth to power, military academies incorporated the Santos case into their leadership and ethics curricula, using it to teach future officers about the importance of evaluating subordinates' contributions objectively and protecting personnel who proposed legitimate improvements to military practices. The case became a standard example of how institutional arrogance and careerism could prevent military organizations from benefiting from the expertise and innovations of their own personnel. Cadets studied both Carlos Santos's technical contributions and Maria Santos's patient determination as examples of how dedication to truth could eventually overcome institutional injustice. Defense contractors and civilian research institutions began investigating their own historical records for cases where technical innovations might have been suppressed for political rather than scientific reasons. The Santos vindication had demonstrated that valuable work could remain buried for decades when institutional interests conflicted with technical merit. Several corporations discovered that their current technical challenges had been solved years earlier by employees whose work had been dismissed or classified to prevent competitors from benefiting from their innovations. The mystery surrounding Maria Santos's disappearance from public view became part of her legend within military communications communities. Unconfirmed reports suggested she had been seen at various locations where communications equipment was being tested or where historical military facilities were being investigated. Some stories claimed she was working with other families to investigate cases of wrongful discharge or suppressed innovations. Others suggested she had returned to academic study or civilian research related to communications technology. Personnel who had worked with Maria at Forward Operating Base Viper occasionally received anonymous technical documents containing communications improvements that bore the hallmarks of Carlos Santos's innovative approaches. These documents were always accurate and valuable, leading to speculation that Maria was continuing her grandfather's work in civilian contexts. The improvements were implemented without fanfare, creating incremental progress in military communications capabilities, while maintaining the anonymity that Maria had chosen after leaving military service. International military organizations began examining their own historical records for cases similar to the Santos situation, recognizing that institutional bias and political pressure could affect military organizations worldwide. NATO communications committees requested copies of Carlos Santos's technical documentation, leading to adoption of his techniques by allied forces and improvement in joint operations capabilities. The Santos case became a model for how individual courage and determination could trigger institutional reform that benefited military effectiveness across national boundaries. The transformation of military communications doctrine that resulted from Maria Santos's single act of vindication demonstrated the principle that truth possesses its own momentum once it achieves initial recognition. Her grandfather's suppressed innovations had been waiting for decades for someone with the knowledge, determination, and opportunity to prove their value. Maria's patient preparation and strategic positioning had created the circumstances where justice became possible and institutional change became inevitable. 5 years after the communications crisis at Forward Operating Base Viper, military historians attempting to document the complete story of the Santos case discovered that Maria had quietly influenced dozens of similar situations involving suppressed innovations and wrongful accusations. Her approach had always been the same: thorough preparation, strategic positioning, and demonstration of truth through practical results rather than confrontation or publicity. The legend of Maria Santos had become a symbol of how individual determination could achieve justice and institutional reform through quiet persistence and unwavering commitment to truth. The story continues to inspire military personnel and civilians who face institutional resistance to legitimate improvements or who seek justice for historical wrongs. The principle that Maria Santos demonstrated, that sometimes the most powerful response to institutional failure is simply asking for permission to show a better way, has become a model for how individual courage can create lasting change without requiring dramatic confrontation or public recognition. 10 years later, a young communications specialist named David Chun arrived at his first assignment, carrying a worn technical manual that his grandfather had left him. The manual contained handwritten notes about frequency, management, and tactical coordination that his grandfather claimed had been used by the most brilliant radio operator he'd ever encountered. David had always assumed the stories were exaggerated, until he began implementing the techniques during routine training exercises. His commanding officer, Colonel Harrison, now nearing retirement, watched David work and felt a familiar recognition. The young soldier's approach to communications challenges, his understanding of historical techniques, and his quiet confidence reminded Harrison of someone he had encountered years earlier, during a crisis that had changed his entire perspective. On leadership and innovation. After the training exercise, Colonel Harrison approached David privately. "Where did you learn those communication techniques, son?" David smiled and opened his grandfather's manual to a page that contained a simple inscription. "These methods were taught to me by Sergeant Maria Santos, who proved that truth never needs permission to be heard. It only needs someone brave enough to speak it." Colonel Harrison realized that Maria's influence had continued far beyond her military service, passing through generations of people who understood that innovation and justice required both technical knowledge and moral courage. She had created a legacy that existed not in official records or public recognition, but in the quiet determination of individuals who refused to accept inadequate solutions when better approaches were possible. The story of the radio operator, who became the last line of defense, reminds us that extraordinary capabilities often hide behind ordinary appearances, and that sometimes the most important question we can ask is simply, "May I try?" Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated because of their background or position? Share your story in the comments below. If you believe in the power of quiet determination and the importance of fighting for truth, hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who celebrate stories of courage that change the world. Remember to ring the notification bell so you never miss these inspiring true stories that prove ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to accept injustice